Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Joining me as he does every week very generously is my dear friend, Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News. And we are talking about church news, current events in light of church teaching. Matthew, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Oh, great to be with you. And I have to say that it was a privilege and really a great joy, just a lot of fun to be able to spend time with you and Brian and everyone else on the Good News Cruise last week. It seems hard to imagine that it was already a week ago.
Oh gosh, it's already been almost a full week since we left. Okay, so a lot has happened since we last spoke about these issues on the air. I want to begin by talking about the Board of Peace. You and I touched on this. We giggled about it a little, and the outcome turned out to be exactly what we thought. But it was diplomatic of them to take some time to consider.
Yeah, so you're referring, of course, to the Board of Peace that was created by President Trump. He invited a number of governments to participate in it. Essentially, there was a buy-in of about $1 billion, and ostensibly was created to assist in the implementation of the 20-point plan to end the war in Gaza. And each government pledged, saying billions of dollars in the pursuit of the lasting peace there. It is very clear diplomatically that this is a sidestep, that this is an effort to go around the United Nations and to, in some ways, rebuild the global order. And most of the European countries have chosen not to participate. And one of the invitations that was sent out by the Trump administration was to Pope Leo XIV, for the Vatican, the Holy See, to participate in the Board of Peace. At the end of January, they mentioned that was certainly something they were considering. But we know now that their official position is that the Holy See will not participate in this Board of Peace. And they issued a number of different reasons. But I think at the heart of it is the Holy See's commitment, the Holy Father's commitment to the structure and the legacy of the United Nations.
I'm really glad you bring that particular issue up, because that's been a big part of the conversation I'd like to invite you to speak into. By the Holy See doing this, rejecting entry, if you will, or participation in the Board of Peace, it doesn't mean that the Holy See is then avowing complete allegiance to the United Nations either. But there clearly is a conflict of interest that is being addressed.
Yeah, that's right. So there are a couple of points I think that need to be looked at. The first is that obviously the Board of Peace is a peculiar creation. I'm not judging it in any way. It's peculiar in the sense of that it is out of the ordinary in the approach to finding peace, certainly in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world. The Holy See, for its part, mentioned that the very particular nature of the Board of Peace, and Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, made that pretty clear when he spoke to the press right after a meeting at the Palazzo Borromeo, ironically on the occasion of the anniversary of the Lateran Pacts, which date back all the way to 1929, which helped create what we now think of as the sovereign state of Vatican City. And he mentioned that it is particular because it is clearly not that of other states. So in other words, this is something highly unusual. Now, when you add to that, that he went on to say that there were a few other points that he used the word perplexed, that would need to be explained. So he isn't completely shutting the door to the participation of the Holy See at some point in the future, but there are obvious needs for clarification. And he said one major concern is that at the international level, it is primarily the United Nations that manages these crisis situations. So as he said, this is a point on which we have emphasized. Now, what does that mean? It means that the Holy See recognizes the traditional locus of an effort, successful or not, as history has proven, in the United States to deal with these types of situations. Now, that is also a reflection of the long-standing commitment of the Holy See, and this dates back many, many years, to the idea of a multilateral approach. Multilateralism meaning that you want to involve a lot of different states in crisis solving, again, within sort of the shadow or within the structure of the United Nations as the recognized international body for trying to resolve them. So I think this is just the Holy See's commitment to what has long been practiced diplomatically, and I don't think it sees at this point any benefit in rupturing that for what may ultimately be a temporary board consistent with the present Trump administration.
I invite your wisdom, therefore, to also comment on the countries that have participated in this Board of Peace. Most noteworthily, many of the more influential and developed Islamic nations in the Middle East. I invite you to enlighten our listeners as to what's the thought process behind that.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things at work. About 25 countries have announced their participation. A few aren't particularly surprising. Argentina, with Javier Milei, who is a close global ally of President Trump. El Salvador, which also has a very conservative and admittedly very successful president. And then also Hungary, which is one of the strongest supporters of the Trump administration and the implementation of many of the immigration policies that really do have it standing out in comparison to the rest of Europe. Closest nearby would be Poland. But you're absolutely right that we have a number of other countries, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Morocco in particular, are on board with this plan. Why? I think because they want to have a seat at the table. President Trump right now is the dominant political force. He is the one who brought about in so many different ways the current situation of peace or the movement toward peace in Gaza. And I think there's a classic diplomatic parlance says they want to have a seat at the table. They want to be able to influence the longer term stabilization of the region. It's in their best interest to do everything they can to try to bring stability to the region, because the alternative, as we have seen in Gaza, with Iran, in Syria, in Iraq, it's a grim prospect should a regional war erupt, such as the risk that currently exists with Iran, but the regional war that everyone was concerned might erupt out of Israel's campaign in Gaza, justified as Israel feels that it was, as well as its interventions in Lebanon in trying to exterminate Hezbollah, which of course is one of the most committed of the enemies of Israel.
What this also communicates to us is that despite the clearly Islamic identities of each of those nations constitutionally, there is a collective interest of self-preservation, contrary to some of the movements we're seeing governmentally in, as you mentioned, Iran, Iraq, and most definitely Hamas. Yeah,
precisely. And I think you make an important distinction, too, between Hamas and the Palestinian people. And that's a point that always has to be made. The pro-Palestinian movement, certainly in Western countries, has received a great deal of financial support from left-wing causes, and most frequently does not differentiate between Hamas and, say, the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinians themselves, who are trapped in many ways in this cycle of violence that Hamas has, especially since October 7th, and its vicious attack on Israel with the corresponding result of the Gaza campaign. So self-preservation, I think, is a very keen word to apply to this set of circumstances, because, again, these countries want to be able to influence what comes in the future. And they see right now, at least, the Board of Peace as their best option, given the dominance of President Trump and the Trump administration under
we need to pause
what I think
there,
has been a
Matthew.
very talented thing with Marco Rubio.
Thank you. I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Bunson. The music is hitting. We're continuing on the other side of the break, talking about church news and current events in light of church teaching. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Beat. I'm talking with my dear friend Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director of EWTN News, and we're talking about church news, current events. Matthew, we were just talking about the Board of Peace and all of the moving parts affiliated with that. I want to move on to very quickly look at the situation with the Society of St. Pius X. When we covered it before, we knew there would be updates. We both suspected, maybe prophetically, that it wouldn't go favorably. What's happening now?
Yeah, well, so the last we talked, I think, the heads of the Society of St. Pius X, in this particular case, so Father Pagliarani, had met with the head of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, and that's Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, in an effort to head off an impending crisis with the plan on the part of the Society of St. Pius X to consecrate several bishops without, obviously, a papal mandate, which, of course, would constitute a very severe break in communion and would, of course, halt all of the talks that had been ongoing. Well, after they went back, the heads of the Society of St. Pius X, again under Father David Pagliarani, issued a response. And the response basically is that while they are willing to have dialogue, for them, they are essentially saying that they are walking away and that they continue to plan to consecrate those bishops on July 1st, again, without a papal mandate. Now, obviously, this represents the risk of decisive rupture, or what has also been phrased as grave consequences. And what's interesting is that in the letter from Father Pagliarani, it's important, and I know you've read the letter and I'm sure you've dissected it too, that for them, the doctrinal questions for them remain paramount, even though the DDF, the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, had just recently proposed what, from its side, described as, quote, a specifically theological path of dialogue, looking again at what would be considered the minimum conditions for full communion. But the SSPX has decided in its new statement that, A, the characterization of unauthorized consecrations as potentially schismatic, they disagree with that. And he's trying to cloak this within what they claim would be a genuine case of conscience, and that the doctrinal conflicts remain very severe, and that they are not, in their view, in a position to dialogue further, at least in the sense of the discussion, the ecclesiological realities flowing from the Second Vatican Council, and of course the liturgical changes and reforms that followed.
Based on the statement, it became very clear to me, at the very least, that the Society was remaining completely unchanging in terms of its stalwart mission for a version of the faith that pre-exists the Second Vatican Council. And so any number of teachings, developments, and definitely ecclesial obedience is brought into question based on that definition. I invite you to comment on why that's a concerning stance to hold and how we, the faithful, ought to be cautious and remain magisterially faithful.
Yeah, obviously, from the position laid out in this letter, and he goes on to say that to us, this is Father Pagliarani, it does not seem possible to enter into a dialogue to define what the minimum requirements might be for ecclesial communion simply because this task does not belong to us. That's a somewhat interesting but curious position to take. They seem to hold the position that, as he puts it, the criteria for belonging to the church have been established and defined by the magisterium. So that we're back to the basic problem here of the rejection of the Second Vatican Council and everything that has followed. And he goes on also to note that the set of texts open to, as he says, the Second Vatican Council is not a set of texts open to free interpretation. It has been received, developed, and applied for 60 years by successive popes. That simple recognition would tell you that from the Catholic Church's position, this is set. And the unwillingness then to budge on some of those key points, I think, is creating the impasse. But the one saving hope here is that these consecrations are not scheduled until July 1st. That's still some months away. So there is at least the possibility then of further discussion leading to, again, what the DVF has described as a specifically theological path of discussion. Now, we can always ask, what does that mean in terms of a theological specific path? That we'll have to see. But I think one point will always remain the teachings of the Second Vatican Council and the acceptance of it by the Church, the implementation of it by an ecumenical council, the foundational documents that it has informed in the papal magisteriums of multiple popes since then. So we are here then at an ecclesiological and liturgical impasse. Mm-hmm. And personally, I'm not particularly optimistic that that some sort of a resolution can be achieved, in part because for its part, the SSPX is determined to do this. And the consequences speak for themselves in church law, but also in church theology.
You and me both, my friend, and we'll have to pray, and also pray that the faithful don't get swayed by these events. To shift gears into doctrinal issues, the situation with Notre Dame University, Vatican officials have weighed in. There's a real controversy here. What do we know?
Yeah, so obviously, when we're talking about Notre Dame, we're talking about what is, for many people, a really heartbreaking situation, mm-hmm. because Notre Dame itself chose to appoint a ardently pro-abortion person to take on a very significant position in teaching. And so it's a pro-abortion professor, and it has really raised the question about the Catholic identity of one of the country's most important universities, and is it truly committed to all of the teachings of the Church? So what we're really speaking about is the appointment of somebody to take over University of Notre Dame's Asian Studies program. And in this case, the objections to this appointment stemmed from the fact that this person who's going to be put in charge of it holds a position not just ardently supporting abortion, but using some really intense language in support of it, and even connecting opposition to it to things like white supremacy. So in this case, it's Susan Osterman, who's supposed to become the Institute for Asian Studies new leader on July 1st. Mm-hmm. That appointment led to several resignations of Notre Dame professors. It has led to a pretty significant uproar among much of the student body. Bishops in the United States and around the world expressed their grave concerns over all of this. But Notre Dame, to no one's particular surprise, has announced basically they're doubling down on this appointment. And I think that is a very unfortunate position. Now, as you note, the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life weighed in. That's Monsignor Renzo Pegoraro, mm-hmm. Who was asked about this controversy. And he said that abortion is not acceptable as a practice, and that it is a responsibility not only of individuals but of society to help women and couples avoid the idea that abortion could be a solution to a difficult pregnancy or a problem. But he did add that, as he says, we try to see how to maintain a debate about convincing people that abortion is not only a solution to a problem but is a big challenge. And he said that we try to stress more the ethical and some social aspects, not immediately, as he says, only the legal aspects of this. So some probably were frustrated that they would have preferred a more fulsome denunciation. But as we have seen in the past, coming out of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and with many Vatican officials in general, they assume a much more diplomatic tone, as is their wont to do.
Well, Matthew, thank you very much for your time discussing all these pieces of church news. My guest has been Dr. Matthew Bunson, Vice President, Editorial Director of EWTN News. We've been talking about church news and current events in light of church teaching. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.